The first time Mara West heard the snap of a branch outside her cabin, she thought it was the wind, but the wind didn't carry the sound of measured, deliberate footsteps. Mara had lived alone for 3 long years in this remote stretch of pine-dense wilderness, far from any town or traveler, and she had grown accustomed to the quiet, the endless whisper of trees, and the sharp tang of pine resin in the air. Yet now, in the deep orange glow of sunset, her pulse hammered against her ribs as if warning her that this evening would be unlike any other. Her cabin, a modest structure of cedar logs stacked tightly and sealed with tar and mud, stood in a small clearing. Smoke drifted lazily from the stone chimney, curling in the fading light like a ghost. Mara's hands trembled slightly as she set down her tin cup of coffee, listening. The smell of roasted beans mingled with the earthy perfume of damp needles, but it did little to calm her rising fear. Then a silhouette emerged from the tree line. Tall, broad-shouldered, and moving with a fluid, quiet power, the stranger paused a few dozen feet from the cabin. His skin glinted in the fading sun, bronzed and smooth, his dark hair falling long over his shoulders. Mara's breath caught. Her mind screamed to lock the door, grab her hunting rifle, and hide, but something in the stranger's stance made her hesitate. He wasn't yelling, waving, or brandishing a weapon. He simply stood there, as though assessing her, the cabin, the air itself. "Who's there?" Mara's voice trembled despite her effort to sound firm. The man did not respond immediately. He tilted his head slightly, eyes sharp and dark, and then finally spoke in a language Mara didn't understand. Still, his tone was low, deliberate, almost musical in its cadence. He gestured with one hand as if asking for her trust, though Mara's instincts screamed against it. Her heart pounded as she edged toward the door. Years of isolation had sharpened her self-reliance. She knew how to survive. But this was different. The air itself seemed charged, and she felt it prickling against her skin like static before a storm. Minutes stretched. The stranger moved slowly into the clearing, careful not to break any branches. Mara's eyes widened as she noticed the leather straps and beads woven into his hair, the faint gleam of tribal markings on his arms. An Apache, her mind raced. Tales of frontier violence, of Apache warriors defending their lands, of sudden raids flashed before her eyes. Fear rooted her in place. Yet even as her instincts screamed danger, there was something else. A raw, magnetic energy emanated from him, the kind that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Mara swallowed hard. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of smoke and pine needles and something else, something wild, untamed and alive. "Wait," she said, more to herself than to him. Her hand rested on the hilt of the rifle she kept near the door. "Just wait." He froze. Then, slowly, he lowered his hand, his dark eyes locking onto hers. Mara felt a chill run down her spine as though the man could see past her defenses, past the wall she had built in 3 years of solitude, and then it happened. He stepped forward. Not aggressively, not threateningly, but deliberately toward her cabin. Mara backed into the shadows, heart hammering, unsure if she should flee into the forest or hold her ground. Her mind raced with scenarios. He could be a scout, a wanderer, or a threat beyond comprehension. The first night in the wilderness is always the hardest for strangers, Mara thought. And yet, a deeper part of her, the part that had longed for connection, even as she resisted it, whispered something dangerous. Maybe he wasn't the danger. Maybe. He was the beginning of something she had never dared to imagine. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the shadows grew long, stretching across the clearing like dark fingers. Mara gripped her rifle, knuckles white, as the stranger finally spoke again, this time in a few words of broken English, careful and cautious. "Safe? Shelter?" Mara's breath caught. Her mind fought fear with curiosity, and in that moment, she knew the night would change everything. Mara's hand shook as she unlatched the cabin door, her heart hammering against her chest like a drum. Taha, the Apache who had silently appeared at the edge of her clearing, stepped into the threshold, his gaze steady, unwavering, almost unnerving in its intensity. The last light of sunset touched the planes of his bronze skin, making him appear almost carved from stone. "You." "Come in," Mara whispered, barely above the hiss of the wind through the pine needles. Taha nodded once, slow and deliberate, and stepped across the threshold. His presence was overwhelming, magnetic. Mara felt her pulse spike, not from fear, though some still lingered, but from a strange, undeniable awareness of him, as if every nerve ending in her body was alert to his proximity. She motioned toward the small hearth. "Sit. Fires?" "Warm," her voice cracked. She had spent years alone. It was difficult to address another human being without a tinge of suspicion or awkwardness. Taha lowered himself onto a simple wooden chair, his posture relaxed yet commanding, the weight of him pressing the floorboards. He removed a thin leather strap from his wrist, revealing the intricate beadwork and subtle scars etched along his forearm. His eyes met Mara's for a brief moment before looking to the fire, amber light reflecting in the depths of his dark irises. Mara watched him, unsure whether to approach or keep her distance. The smell of pine smoke and roasted coffee filled the small cabin. Outside, the forest had grown darker, the calls of unseen creatures echoing through the night. It was alive in a way Mara had long been accustomed to, but never shared with another soul. "Hungry," Taha said simply, his English rough but understandable. Mara nodded and moved toward the small wooden table. She poured coffee into a tin cup and offered him a piece of dried meat she had kept from earlier. He accepted it without hesitation, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting moment. Electricity, or perhaps something more primal, spiked between them. Mara jerked her hand back, cheeks flushed. She had expected fear to dominate her, but instead, it was an unfamiliar warmth that spread through her chest. As Taha ate, he began to speak in a language Mara didn't understand. His words were rhythmic, almost musical, and even though she could not grasp their meaning, there was something soothing in the sound. Mara's fear gradually ebbed, replaced by curiosity and awe. The cabin, usually her sanctuary, now felt charged with an energy she couldn't name, an unspoken connection bridging the gap between their worlds. Hours passed. Shadows from the fire flickered across the log walls, painting the room with light and darkness, much like Mara's own emotions. She learned the subtle nuances of his movements, the tilt of his head when he was thinking, the way his hands rested on his knees when he spoke, the way his eyes softened when they caught hers. Finally, Taha placed a hand on his chest and gave a small nod toward Mara. He wanted her to understand something, even if words failed. Mara realized he was asking if he could stay the night. Her chest tightened. Fear, caution, and something unnameable tangled inside her. But the forest outside was dark and cold, the night filled with hidden dangers, and Mara's instincts whispered that this man, this mysterious warrior, was not a threat. "All right," she said softly. "You can stay." Taha's lips curved into the faintest smile, a subtle acknowledgement of trust. He moved to the corner of the cabin and laid a simple blanket on the floor, close enough to the fire to feel its warmth. Mara watched him, her heart pounding, her mind a whirl of questions. Who was he really? Why had he come here? And most disconcerting of all, why did she feel drawn to him in a way she had not felt for any living soul in years? Night deepened, thick and velvety, pressing against the cabin walls. Outside, the forest whispered its secrets, but Mara felt a strange sense of calm as she moved to her own cot. She lay awake, listening to Taha's steady breathing, the rhythm strong and assured. For the first time in years, Mara felt less alone, though she did not yet know the weight of what this night would bring Dot in the dark. She thought of the strange pull she felt toward Taha. It was unsettling and thrilling all at once. A feeling she could not name, a warmth she could not explain. She understood that something had begun between them in the space of a single, fragile night. A night that could change everything. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying the scent of pine, smoke, and something wild. Something alive. Mara closed her eyes and let herself sink into a restless sleep, unaware that the bond forming in this cabin would challenge everything she had known about solitude, fear, and desire. The first light of dawn filtered through the gaps in the log walls, painting Mara's cabin in pale gold. She lay on her cot, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of Taha, and for a moment she allowed herself to forget the fear that had driven her for so many years. But the wilderness never forgot, and Mara knew that peace was fragile here. Taha stirred, sitting up and stretching his powerful arms. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the smell of pine and smoke mingled with the crisp morning air drifting in through the open window. Mara felt a strange pull in her chest, an almost magnetic curiosity that made her move closer without thinking. "Morning," she said softly. Careful not to startle him, Taha's dark eyes met hers. Calm and unreadable, and he inclined his head slightly. "Morning," he replied, his voice low, resonant, carrying the weight of quiet authority. There was a hint of something unspoken, a promise perhaps, that made Mara's pulse quicken. Breakfast was silent, shared over small portions of hard bread and dried meat Mara had kept from her last supply run. Words were scarce, but the unspoken understanding between them grew heavier with every glance, every gesture. Mara found herself stealing looks at him, noticing the way the sunlight caught the planes of his chest, the subtle strength in the way he moved, even in mundane tasks. Outside, the wind shifted. The pines groaned as a distant storm brewed over the hills. Mara's senses, honed by years of solitude, prickled. "Storm coming," she said, more to herself than to Taha. "Should prepare." Taha rose without hesitation, moving to the door to survey the tree line. Mara watched him, amazed at the quiet confidence in his stance. "We tie wood, secure door?" he asked. His English was broken, but each word carried clarity. A pragmatism Mara had rarely encountered in anyone. Together, they worked in unspoken coordination, stacking extra logs near the fireplace, checking the roof for loose shingles, and securing the cabin's simple wooden shutters. The storm's growl rolled closer, shaking the tall pines and sending a shower of needles across the forest floor. Mara felt a thrill of danger, a reminder that life here was never truly safe, but with Taha. The fear was tempered by trust. As they finished, Mara noticed how his gaze lingered on her. Not with desire, but with quiet fascination, as though he were trying to read her very soul. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, unsure how to meet it. "You used to forest?" she asked tentatively, curiosity breaking the silence. Taha nodded slowly. "Born? Near hills. Learn. Live with trees, water, wind. Understand forest." His words were simple but carried weight. Mara realized that here, in this man, was a knowledge and power she had never encountered in towns or settlements. The wilderness itself seemed to bend toward him. The first drops of rain fell, cold and insistent. Mara pulled the shutters tight, and they retreated to the warmth of the cabin. The storm outside intensified, wind lashing against the walls and the trees groaning under the force. Mara found herself sitting closer to Taha by the fire, drawn by the heat, by the presence, by the quiet reassurance that somehow, amidst this untamed wilderness, she was not entirely alone. They spoke little during the afternoon. Instead, Their connection grew in gestures and shared glances. Mara found comfort in the way Taha's hand rested lightly on his knee, how he moved with quiet grace, how his presence was both grounding and exhilarating. She felt emotions she hadn't allowed herself in years: fascination, warmth, longing, and a creeping sense of vulnerability she wasn't used to. As evening fell, the storm outside softened to a persistent patter against the roof. Mara moved closer to the fire, and Taha followed, his shadow merging with hers in the flickering light. For the first time since her years of solitude, Mara allowed herself to speak freely. "You stay longer?" Taha's gaze softened and he nodded. "If you want. Not leave." Mara's heart thumped. She realized that what had begun as fear and suspicion was transforming into something else entirely. In this cabin, amidst the storm and the wilderness, she was beginning to feel alive again, awakened by a man whose presence was as wild and untamed as the forest itself. Outside, the night crept closer, and the wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the promise of more storms, both from the sky and from within the hearts of Mara and Taha. Yet for the first time, Mara faced them not alone, but with the man who had arrived unbidden and refused to leave her thoughts or her life. The morning after the storm left the forest glistening with rain, Mara stepped outside her cabin and inhaled the crisp, earthy scent of wet pine. Droplets clung to the needles and moss, and the forest seemed renewed. Yet Mara sensed a tension lingering in the air, something she couldn't quite name. Taha was already outside, standing tall among the trees, scanning the horizon with alert, penetrating eyes. "Morning," Mara called softly. Taha turned, his long black hair damp from the lingering mist, and gave her a small nod. "Morning, storm." "Gone, but forest." "Watching." His voice, calm and deep, carried a warning in its rhythm. Mara shivered despite the warmth of the sun breaking through the clouds. They worked together to secure the perimeter of the cabin, ensuring that fallen branches from the storm hadn't damaged the roof or walls. Mara noticed how methodical Taha was, every movement deliberate, precise, almost ritualistic. He examined the forest with a predator's awareness, listening to the subtle creaks and sighs of the trees, reading the signs Mara would have missed. As the day wore on, Mara began to relax slightly, though she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being observed. Her instincts, honed by years of isolation, were sharp, and the forest seemed to whisper warnings only she could hear. She glanced at Taha, who had noticed nothing outwardly alarming. Yet she trusted that if danger lurked, he would sense it first. By mid-afternoon, Mara and Taha had finished their work. Mara decided to fetch water from the creek nearby, a task she had done countless times alone. Taha followed silently, moving with an almost imperceptible grace. Mara felt a strange thrill at having him by her side, both a comfort and a fire of unspoken tension. The creek was swollen from the storm, water rushing over rocks with a ferocity that mirrored her heartbeat. Mara knelt to fill her bucket, and Taha knelt beside her. The proximity sent a heat rushing through her that she could not explain, a magnetic pull she had tried to resist. "You trust?" Taha asked suddenly, his dark eyes fixed on hers. Mara hesitated, feeling the weight of the question. She had learned long ago to rely only on herself. Yet here was a man, silent, enigmatic, and utterly captivating, asking for her trust in a world that had taught her caution. "I try," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the creek. Taha inclined his head slightly, a small acknowledgement, then stood and gestured for her to follow. Mara rose, heart hammering, and they began to move deeper into the forest. The dense pines and moss-covered ground muffled their steps. Mara's senses were alert. Every shadow, every rustle seemed amplified. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the trees, a branch snapping under heavy weight. Mara froze, and Taha was instantly at her side, his body tense and ready, eyes scanning the woods with ferocious focus. Mara could feel the raw energy emanating from him, a force that was both protective and electrifying. Out of the shadows stepped a lone figure, a hunter from a nearby settlement, rifle slung across his back. He froze when he saw Taha, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Mara's first instinct was fear, but Taha's presence radiated authority. The hunter's confidence waned under his gaze. "Who? You?" The man, STAMMERE.TAA single quotes S reply was measured, calm, and firm. "Forest hours go." "Leave." The man hesitated, then nodded quickly, backing away. Mara's heart was still racing as the tension in the forest slowly receded. She looked at Taha, the intensity in his gaze softening as he returned to her side. Mara realized, with a mixture of awe and something more tender, that this man, the Apache who had entered her life so suddenly, was not only her protector, but had begun to occupy a place in her heart that no one else ever had done as they returned to the cabin. Mara felt the first real flicker of connection, fragile yet undeniable. She understood that the wilderness, with all its danger and mystery, had brought her to this man. And perhaps he had brought her back to life in ways she hadn't known she needed. That night, as they sat by the fire listening to the whispers of the forest, Mara let herself lean closer to Taha, the warmth of his presence easing the cold she had carried for so long. Outside, shadows danced in the pines, and Mara knew that more challenges awaited, but for the first time, she felt she was not facing them alone. The forest was alive with secrets, and so were they. And Mara understood that the bond forming between her and Taha was no mere coincidence. It was the beginning of a connection that could not be denied, no matter what the wilderness had in store. The evening was heavy with silence, the forest around Mara's cabin still glistening from the storm earlier in the week. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, but something else lingered, a faint acrid tang that made Mara pause as she stepped onto the porch. Taha was already outside, shirtless, his bronzed skin glistening in the dying light, muscles taut as he scanned the tree line. His long black hair hung loose over his shoulders, and the subtle tribal jewelry glimmered faintly in the fading sun. "Smoke," Mara whispered, her voice tight with tension. Taha's dark eyes narrowed. "Not forest, fire." "Closer." His voice was calm, but the edge of urgency made Mara's stomach tighten. He gestured for her to follow, and she moved without hesitation. Trusting the instinct that had drawn her to him in these past days, they moved through the forest with silent precision, Mara's boots sinking slightly into the damp moss. Taha led the way, eyes sharp, body moving with the grace and awareness of someone born to the wild. Mara followed, heart pounding, adrenaline mingling with a strange, unfamiliar warmth whenever she was near him. She tried to focus on the fire, but the closeness of Taha, his presence, his scent, the quiet power he exuded distracted her more than she cared to admit through the dense pines. They saw it, a fire burning along the slope of a nearby hill, crackling and licking at the dry underbrush. Smoke spiraled into the dusky sky. Mara's breath caught. This was no natural brush fire, it moved too quickly with a force that spoke of human intent. "They hunt," Taha said softly, almost to himself. "Not random. Target something." Mara's pulse quickened. "Us?" she asked, voice barely audible. The thought of their cabin being attacked, of their fragile safety shattered, sent a shiver through her. Taha shook his head. "Maybe. Not only. Watch." Forest. His eyes scanned the surrounding trees, the dark shadows stretching long in the fading light. Mara realized that despite the danger, she felt a strange calm knowing Taha was there. There was no one else she would rather have at her side in the face of such peril. As the fire crept closer, Mara and Taha retreated toward the cabin, strategizing in silence. Taha gathered fallen logs and branches, creating a crude barricade around the cabin, while Mara retrieved water from the nearby creek. The wind shifted again, and the scent of smoke pressed into the cabin like a warning. Mara's hands trembled, but Taha's steady presence kept her grounded. Night fell quickly, and the fire's glow lit the horizon, red and ominous. Taha stood at the cabin's edge, alert, muscles coiled like a spring, his eyes never leaving the encroaching flames. Mara moved closer, instinctively seeking warmth, not just from the cold, but from him. She noticed the way his jaw tensed with focus, the subtle twitch of a scarred shoulder as he prepared for anything. Suddenly, the fire leapt higher, a controlled blaze, set by unknown assailants, and Mara realized the gravity of the threat. They were not dealing with a simple wildfire. Someone intended to drive them from their home, to make Mara's sanctuary theirs. Taha's hand found hers, firm, grounding, and Mara felt an electric jolt. He didn't speak. Words were unnecessary. Together, they moved with purpose, extinguishing small flare-ups near the cabin with water, tossing dirt on embers, and reinforcing their barricade. Mara felt her fear transform into resolve. She wasn't alone. Taha's presence made her feel capable of facing anything. Hours passed. The fire burned on the hill, but their cabin remained intact, shielded by Taha's skill and instinct. Mara sank beside the fire, exhausted, her body trembling from adrenaline and relief. Taha sat beside her, his hand resting lightly on hers, his eyes scanning the shadows beyond the trees even as the immediate danger had passed. Safe. For now, he murmured, voice low and steady. Mara exhaled slowly, leaning slightly against him. Her heart still raced, but the fear that had gripped her earlier softened into something else: trust, gratitude, and the fragile beginnings of love. She realized that in the past 5 days, her life had changed irreversibly. This man, mysterious and wild, had entered her world, and she could not imagine retreating back to solitude. Outside, the night whispered through the pines, carrying the distant crackle of the fire and the faint promise of another day. Mara's gaze met Taha's, and in that moment, she understood, whatever dangers the wilderness or men might bring, they would face them together. For the first time in years, Mara felt truly alive. The forest was quiet now, the fire on the distant hill reduced to smoldering embers. Yet Mara could not shake the lingering tension. She sat on the edge of her cot, hands wrapped around a tin cup of lukewarm coffee, listening to the faint whisper of wind through the pines. The adrenaline from the day's danger still pulsed in her veins, and her thoughts were a whirl of fear, fascination, and a growing, unnameable longing for Taha. He moved quietly near the hearth, shirtless, his bronzed skin illuminated by the flickering flames. Long black hair fell over his shoulders, partially hiding the intricate beaded necklaces and leather armbands that marked him as both warrior and survivor. Mara's eyes followed him as he adjusted the logs in the fire, each movement precise and fluid, radiating power and calm confidence at once. For several moments, neither spoke. The forest outside was dark and alive with nocturnal sounds, but inside the cabin, the tension between them was palpable. Mara's heartbeat quickened as she realized that this man, this enigmatic, fearless, and magnetic presence, was no longer just her protector. He had begun to inhabit a space in her heart that she had long kept empty. Taha turned, eyes meeting hers in the dim firelight. "Mara," he said softly, voice low and steady. "You?" Fear, yet trust. Her throat tightened. How could he see so clearly, even through the walls she had built around herself? Yes, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I fear. but I also feel safe with you. His expression softened, and he stepped closer, every movement deliberate, yet careful not to overwhelm her. Forest. Hard. Life. Harsh. You? Alone. Now? Not alone. Mara's chest tightened with something she could not name. She took a cautious step forward, drawn by his presence and the warmth emanating from his body. Taha's gaze never wavered, steady and patient, as though he understood the delicate balance of fear and desire she was navigating. The silence stretched between them, thick with emotion, until Mara finally found the courage to speak. Taha, why did you come here? Why me? He looked away briefly, the firelight dancing across his chiseled features. Fate? Paths cross. You? Alone. I watch. Then stay. Protect? You. Something. Strong, not usual. Mara's lips parted, heart hammering. She felt the pull between them, raw and undeniable, a magnetic energy that drew her closer despite her caution. She realized that in these past days she had fallen into the rhythm of his presence, the calm strength he offered, the understanding that required no words, the wild intensity that made her pulse race. Slowly. She reached out, her hand brushing against his forearm. The contact was electric, sending a warmth through her she had not felt in years. Taha's hand hovered for a heartbeat before covering hers, his touch firm, protective, and grounding. Mara's breath caught. The cabin, the forest, the distant fire, they all seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them suspended in a fragile, intense moment. Mara, Taha murmured, his dark eyes holding hers with unwavering focus. Not alone. Trust, heart. She nodded, trembling slightly, and allowed herself to step closer. The heat between them was undeniable, a slow-burning fire that matched the remnants of the wildfire outside. Mara felt her defenses dissolve, replaced by a longing she had buried deep under years of solitude. They sat together near the fire, shoulders almost touching, hands intertwined. Words were unnecessary. The quiet intimacy spoke volumes, a shared heartbeat, a connection forged in trust, danger, and the untamed wilderness around them. Mara realized that her life had shifted irrevocably. This man, wild and fierce and utterly magnetic, had become not only her protector but her anchor, the only presence capable of drawing her out of the isolation she had clung to for so long. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of smoke and wet earth. Mara leaned her head slightly toward Taha and for the first time in years allowed herself to feel the possibility of a life that included someone else, not just survival, but companionship, desire, and love. The night deepened, stars peeking through gaps in the forest canopy. Mara closed her eyes, resting against Taha, and let herself surrender to the warmth, the strength, and the mystery of the man who had appeared so suddenly in her life. In the quiet, the storm of emotions within her finally found a fragile but undeniable peace. The wilderness was still alive outside, full of shadows and secrets. But Mara felt a new kind of safety, one that came not from isolation, but from connection. And in that firelit cabin, with Taha beside her, she understood that nothing in the forest or in life would ever feel quite the same again. Dawn broke gently over the forest, spilling gold across the treetops and the small clearing where Mara's cabin stood. The night had been long and restless, filled with whispers of the forest and the fading embers of the fire that had kept them warm. Mara stirred on her cot, the memory of last night's closeness with Taha still lingering, a warmth that made her chest ache in the most unfamiliar, welcome way. Taha was already outside, the first rays of sunlight highlighting his bronzed, muscular form. Shirtless, with long black hair catching the morning light and tribal jewelry glinting softly against his chest, he stood like a sentinel, alert and commanding. Mara felt a flutter of both admiration and something deeper, more intimate, in her stomach. She rose, pulling a wool shawl around her shoulders, and stepped onto the porch. "Morning," she said softly, her voice carrying through the misty clearing. Taha turned, his dark eyes locking onto hers with that same penetrating intensity that had haunted and enthralled her since their first meeting. "Morning, Mara," he replied. There was a weight to his tone, a promise, as though words could not contain the bond forming between them. Mara hesitated, then stepped closer. "Taha." "About last night," she murmured, heart pounding. He inclined his head slightly, expression unreadable but patient. "No." "Need words. Feel." "No." And she did. She felt it, the connection, raw and undeniable, forged through danger, trust, and the quiet intimacy of the wilderness. Their shared moments, from the storm to the fire and the nights spent in each other's presence, had transformed her world. Mara understood now that Taha was no longer just a protector or a mystery. He was the heart beating alongside hers, a force as untamed and alive as the forest surrounding them. A distant caw of a crow echoed through the trees, breaking the stillness. Mara and Taha turned toward the sound, instinctively alert, but the forest offered no immediate danger. Still, the vigilance of years spent surviving the wild lingered in both of them. Mara felt it in the tension coiled in Taha's muscles, the watchfulness in his eyes. Yet beneath it all, there was a softness reserved solely for her, a protective warmth that reassured her in ways words could not. They moved together to the edge of the clearing, the morning mist curling around their boots. Mara's hand brushed against his, and without hesitation, Taha entwined his fingers with hers. A thrill ran through her, the culmination of days of fear, curiosity, and slowly growing trust. "I never thought I could feel this way," she whispered. "You? Not alone," Taha said simply. "I stay always." Her breath caught. It was more than a promise. It was a declaration. Mara realized that the walls she had built around her heart over years of solitude were crumbling, replaced by the certainty of connection and the raw, unspoken love that had blossomed in the cabin amidst danger and wilderness. The day stretched before them, the forest alive with a chorus of birds and rustling leaves. Mara and Taha returned to the cabin, hands still intertwined, each step a quiet affirmation of the bond that had formed in so short a time. They worked together to repair small damage from the storm and the fire, but it was no longer a chore, it was a shared purpose, a rhythm of life they now moved through as partners, equals, and companions. As the sun climbed higher, Mara paused to look at Taha. His gaze met hers, and in that moment, everything else faded. The wilderness, the threats, the solitude she had once clung to. What remained was the fierce, unshakable connection between them, the love and trust that had grown stronger with every shared danger and quiet glance. "Mara," Taha said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Forest. Life. Hard. But with you. Good." Tears pricked Mara's eyes, but she smiled, feeling a joy she had never imagined possible in her years of isolation. "With you, Taha, always," she whispered. The wind rustled through the pines, carrying with it the scent of pine, smoke, and rain from the recent storm. Mara leaned her head against Taha's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the strength in his embrace, and the promise of a future that no longer needed to be faced alone. The wilderness stretched endlessly around them, wild and untamed, yet for the first time. Mara felt safe not because the forest was without danger, but because she had found someone who would face it with her. Taha, The mysterious, fearless Apache who had appeared so suddenly in her life was now her anchor, her companion, and her love. And in the quiet of the forest, with sunlight spilling across the clearing, Mara and Taha stood together, ready to face whatever the wilderness or life would throw at them. For the first time in years, they were not alone. And for the first time, Mara knew that love could thrive even in the wildest, most untamed corners of the world.